The Shelby Cobra Daytona is arguably one of the most significant American racing cars ever made, already using at the time a very successful Shelby Cobra chassis. Carroll Shelby set out to create a more aerodynamic racing machine without compromising the very impressive performance that came with the Shelby Cobra already. Thus, the Cobra Daytona Coupé was born. Its main goal was to beat Ferrari in the endurance racing series, who had been dominating for years now. A total of 6 chassis were ever built, and all went racing in a large variety of events. Amongst its first victories included GT class wins at the 1964 and 1965 Sebring 12 Hours, a class win and 4th overall at the 1964 Le Mans 24 Hours, and wins at Monza, Daytona, Reims and the Nürburgring, and even breaking 25 speed records at Bonneville. Today we're talking about one of the less successful chassis of the Daytona, the CSX 2300. The car was built at Carrozzeria Grand Sport in Modena, Italy in 1964, and it started its run of races in Europe shortly after the 1964 Tour de France. At the opening race, the car would win the race in the hands of Jochen Niersbach. Shortly after, the car would also win a hill climb event in the Tour de France series, thanks to the legendary driver Bob Bondurant. The second day of the event would prove to be the start of troubles. The accelerator cable broke in the 1-hour race at Rouen. Day 3 of the event would prove to be the last. Engine troubles forced it to retire from the series. Its next stop would be on its home turf, the Daytona 2000km endurance event. Here the car did finish the race, a respectable 6th place finish thanks to Ed Leslie and Alan Grant, while the new improved Ford GT40, also ran by Shelby, won the race, arguably overshadowing the effort from the Daytonas. 1 month later, the car would appear at the Sebring 12-hour race with the same 2 drivers.
Ed Leslie's hit from behind. His engine catches fire. Phil Hill and crewmen are firemen now and quench the blaze.
Once again, it finished the race, 13th place, 3rd in its class, behind 2 other Daytona Coupes. It was at this point that Carroll Shelby leased the car to Ford France to return to Europe. Its only stop as a Ford France entry was at the Nürburgring 1000km race. The car was repainted white with blue and red stripes, the typical Ford France livery. Josh Snesser and Andre Simon qualified as second best Cobra Daytona in 18th, and drove the big white machine to a 12th place finish, 3rd in its class. The car was returned back to Shelby after the race, where they repainted the car back into its classic Guardsman blue colour with the white stripes. The car was then handed over to Alaman Racing for the Reims 12-hour endurance race. The car was to be driven by Jack Sears and John Whitmore, who truly thrashed the car around the track for 12 hours. 7 hours into the race, a piston gave the car troubles, so they removed the piston from the engine and ran the remaining 5 hours with a 7-cylinder engine. Surprisingly, the car would finish in 9th place, 2nd in its class. By the time 1966 came along, the Daytonas were obsolete. Most of the cars would end up being sold to the wealthy and famous, others to racing drivers. Our Daytona would end up being sold in 1966 to a wealthy Japanese sports car enthusiast, Tadashi Sakai. Sakai, at the time, was a regular in the Japanese motorsport competition. His earliest recorded races were in a Chevrolet Corvette back in 1964, in which he got a few podium finishes. He was very impressed by the sheer power of American and European cars, so in 1966, at the age of 23, he bought the Shelby Daytona Coupe for a massive 10 million yen, which was a crazy amount of money back then. The car was then prepared to enter the highest level of Japanese motorsport competition. Its first race was at Suzuka in May 1966, where the car would get its first ever win. However, this wasn't a particular struggle, as the main competition the Daytona faced was the Datsun Fairlady and the Toyota Sports 800, both of which boasted less than 100 horsepower compared to over 300 in the Daytona. It was at this point that actual proper competition arrived for the Daytona, a Porsche 906 imported by Shintaro Taki. The Porsche 906 was one of the most advanced purpose-built racing cars at the time and was superior to the Daytona in a lot of ways. Despite putting up a good fight at the All Japan Driver Championship on Fuji, the Daytona would get second place, beaten by Taki's 906. The car then entered the absolute top of the Japanese motorsport scene, the Japanese Grand Prix. Held at the newly opened Fuji Speedway in 1966, the car would face some of the fastest cars in Japan at the time, including 3 Porsche 906s, the new Nissan R380 and the Toyota 2000 GT. Sakai didn't finish the race, breaking down after 46 laps. It would be the only time Sakai entered the Daytona Coupé in a Japan GP event. Sakai would use his Cobra Daytona for the remainder of 1966. The car did get a few more wins at the time, but this was mainly due to the severe power difference between his Cobra and his competition. The last race Sakai drove his Daytona in was the 1967 Fuji Speed Festival. He ended up in second place, beaten again by Shintaro Taki's Porsche 906. At the end of 1967, the Daytona Coupe changed hands. Sakai sold the car for 3 million yen for each part to racing driver Kazuo Akinen. The car would end up appearing in more events throughout 1968, where the results weren't anything to write home about. Finally, at the 1968 Fuji Japan Grand Prix, the Daytona, by then heavily obsolete, rolled over in a dramatic crash. Kazuo Akinen survived the crash. Coincidentally, Tadashi Sakai was at the same exact race, sporting a Lola T70 Mark II. Kazuo Akinen sold the car shortly after, still in its damaged state. The car changed hands multiple times during the next few years, until it was sold to a Tokyo-based supercar dealer called Tomita Auto. The car was then remodeled into a street car, with the transmission being removed and replaced by an automatic box, and the engine receiving the same treatment, being replaced by a 302 block assumed to be from a Mustang. Tomita Auto advertised the car for 7.8 million yen, roughly about $458,000. Carroll Shelby bought the car somewhere in the late 70s or early 80s for that price. The car was restored to its race specifications and was owned by Shelby up until 2000, when the car was sold for $4.4 million. The car was recently shown at Goodwood in 2015 in perfect condition and still drives to this day.